It was a bitter autumn in London, and the fog rolled low along the Thames like smoke from some monstrous furnace. I had not seen Holmes so restless in weeks. Then Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street with news from Wapping. A shipping clerk had been hanged for the murder of a customs official. Yet another man was found dead only hours after the execution, killed while attempting to auction stolen naval documents at the docks. What made the matter compelling was that the dead man had testified against the prisoner. Scotland Yard believed it a simple revenge killing. Holmes, however, saw what others missed. Within the hour, we were rattling eastward in a hansom cab through rain-swept streets toward the river. Chapter 1. A case presents itself. The night upon which this singular affair commenced was among the bleakest of that melancholy autumn. A freezing drizzle swept along Baker Street, while yellow fog drifted thick against the windows of our rooms at 221B. The city beyond appeared ghost-like beneath the gas lamps, and now and again the muffled clatter of carriage wheels emerged faintly through the mist, before vanishing once more into silence. Filling the room with a dry heat that contrasted pleasantly with the damp cold outside. The smell of strong tobacco, polished leather, and Mrs. Hudson's roasting beef hung richly in the air. Holmes lounged upon the sofa in his dressing gown, long fingers pressed together beneath his sharp chin, while the blue smoke from his pipe curled lazily upward toward the ceiling. "You are restless tonight, Holmes," said I, laying aside the medical journal I had attempted unsuccessfully to read. "Restless?" He smiled faintly without opening his eyes. "My dear Watson, I am positively starving. For food? For work?" Holmes rose suddenly and paced toward the window. "London has become intolerably dull. Petty thefts, jealous husbands, forged wills. I am drowning in mediocrity." Fog. Holmes pulled aside the curtain and peered down into Baker Street below. That is what makes it fascinating. Brutality grows clumsy with civilization. Modern villains cultivate subtlety. I poured fresh coffee from the silver pot beside the fire. The bitter warmth tasted welcome after the chill dampness lingering in the room. "You may yet receive your challenge," said I. Holmes shrugged lightly. "Perhaps, though I confess I should welcome something unusual." At that very instant, there came a violent knocking below. Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps sounded along the passage. A moment later, our landlady entered, visibly flustered. "Inspector Lestrade to see you, Mr. Holmes, and he says the matter is urgent." Holmes's eyes brightened immediately. "Excellent. Show him up at once." Lestrade entered moments later, dripping rainwater upon the carpet. His narrow face appeared unusually pale, and I noticed at once the reddish mud thick upon his boots and trouser cuffs. Holmes observed it too. I saw the quick flicker of interest in his expression, though he said nothing immediately. "You look troubled, Lestrade," said Holmes. "I am." The inspector accepted the brandy I handed him and swallowed it quickly. "A man was murdered tonight at the Limehouse docks." Holmes sank slowly into his chair once more. "Murder rarely disturbs you to this degree. Sit down and tell us everything." Lestrade removed his gloves with nervous fingers. The victim was Silas Drew, dock broker, a disagreeable fellow with dealings all along the eastern riverfront. How was he killed? I asked. Thrown from the balcony of his office, above the auction rooms near Wapping. Lestrade hesitated. At first we believed it an accident. And now? Holmes asked quietly. Holmes became instantly attentive. Arthur Bellamy, said he slowly. The shipping clerk hanged for murdering customs examiner Frederick Hale. Lestrade nodded grimly. You remember the case? Vaguely. Hale discovered irregularities among naval cargo manifests. Bellamy was convicted after a witness claimed to see him fleeing the warehouse. Silas Drew was that witness, said Lestrade. For several moments only the crackling fire disturbed the silence of the room. Lestrade wiped moisture from his brow. We searched Drew's office after the body was discovered. Someone had ransacked the room. Papers burned. Safe emptied. Holmes lit a fresh pipe carefully from the lamp beside him. What sort of papers? Shipping records, mostly. Holmes's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. Mostly. There were rumors during the original investigation, Lestrade admitted reluctantly. Naval schedules, dock inspections, foreign cargo lists. Espionage? I exclaimed. Lestrade lowered his voice instinctively. Possibly. I confess, the significance escaped me entirely at that moment. The reader, perhaps, was more observant than I. Holmes rose suddenly and crossed toward the coat stand. We shall visit the docks immediately. Outside, the cold struck us sharply. Fog rolled heavily through the streets, while wet cobbles gleamed beneath the gas lamps. Our hansom cab rattled eastward through crowded thoroughfares, where the smells of horse sweat, coal smoke, damp wool, and roasting chestnuts mingled thickly in the night air. Holmes remained silent for most of the journey. Only once did he speak. You examined the scene personally, Lestrade. I did. And Drew's office. Yes. Holmes narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Yet you overlooked something. The inspector stared blankly. Holmes pointed lazily toward the reddish mud upon Lestrade's cuffs. Whitechapel clay mixed with coal dust and machine oil. That combination exists only near the eastern loading cranes along Limehouse Basin. You entered the lower dockyards before coming to Baker Street. Lestrade blinked in astonishment. That is extraordinary. Not at all. Holmes smiled faintly. Your left sleeve also carries traces of fresh rope fiber. You leaned against a warehouse pulley while examining the scene. I confess, I had noticed nothing remarkable whatsoever. Looking back, the clue was plain as day. Did you see what I missed? The cab finally stopped near the riverfront. And rotting fish. Cranes loomed like giant skeletons through the fog, while distant steam whistles echoed mournfully along the Thames. A constable guided us toward a narrow brick building overlooking the water. though the chalk outline remained visible upon the slick cobblestones below the balcony. Holmes knelt beside it instantly. "Observe this stain." "Watson." I bent beside him. "Oil?" "Machine lubricant," Holmes corrected softly. "Excellent quality." "And that matters?" "It matters greatly." He produced his lens and examined the ground nearby. "Interesting. What do you see?" I asked. "Dockworker boot impressions." Holmes pointed toward several muddy marks near the wall, heavy heels reinforced with iron nails. Lestrade folded his arms. "There are thousands of dockworkers in Wapping." "Indeed." Holmes rose slowly. "Yet according to your constable, no dockworkers visited Drew tonight." The inspector stared at him sharply. "How could you know that?" Holmes smiled thinly. We climbed the narrow staircase toward Drew's office. The room smelled strongly of cheap cigar smoke, spilled brandy, damp paper, and sea air drifting through the cracked window panes. An overturned chair lay beside the desk, while burned fragments of paper still smoldered faintly within the fireplace. Holmes crossed directly toward the ashes. "Not shipping records," said he quietly. Lestrade frowned. "How can you tell?" Holmes lifted a half-burned fragment carefully with the fire tongs. "Fine linen paper. Expensive." He sniffed lightly. "And scented." I leaned closer. "Perfume?" "Jasmine." Holmes's eyes gleamed suddenly. "A woman's correspondence." Lestrade looked bewildered. "What has that to do with murder?" Holmes stepped slowly toward the rain-streaked window, overlooking the dark river below. "Possibly everything." Nothing in my experience prepared me for what followed next. Chapter 2. Into London's Streets. The following morning broke grey and bitterly cold. Above London, a thin rain drifted steadily against the windows of Baker Street, while fog hung low over the city roofs, like smoke from some vast industrial furnace. I descended shortly after 8 o'clock, to find Holmes already dressed and pacing before the fire, with unusual energy. The room smelled strongly of Turkish tobacco and fresh coffee. Several newspapers lay scattered untidily across the carpet beside his chair, while upon the table rested the charred paper fragments recovered from Drew's office the previous night. "You have discovered something," said I. "Several things." Holmes handed me a cup of coffee, though whether they lead toward truth or deeper confusion remains uncertain. "You suspect the woman who wrote the letters?" Holmes shook his head. "No, but she feared Silas Drew greatly." He lifted one blackened scrap carefully between his fingers. "Observe the paper quality, Watson. Egyptian linen stock, extremely costly." I examined the fragment closely. The perfume remains distinct. "Jasmine," said Holmes. "Rare in England, though fashionable among certain continental circles." He stepped toward the window and peered down into Baker Street, where milk carts rattled faintly through the fog. Had already perceived some deeper significance. Perhaps the reader has done the same. Within the hour we departed eastward toward Wapping. The streets grew steadily rougher as our cab approached the river districts. Coal smoke drifted thickly between the narrow lanes, while labourers hurried through the damp morning wrapped in worn scarves and heavy coats. Everywhere came the sounds of London awakening. Factory whistles, shouting costermongers, creaking wagon wheels, and the distant tolling of church bells through the mist. Our first destination was the office of Edwin Marsh, clerk to the murdered broker. We found the young man pale and visibly shaken inside the auction rooms overlooking Limehouse Basin. The office retained the stale odor of spilled spirits, damp timber, and tobacco smoke from the previous night. Marsh twisted his cap nervously between ink-stained fingers while answering Holmes's questions. "Mr. Drew had many enemies," said he quietly. "Dockworkers hated him. Sailors too." "Because he cheated them?" Holmes asked. Marsh nodded. "He bought stolen cargo cheap and sold it dear." There was always trouble surrounding him. Holmes wandered slowly about the room, examining shelves, desk drawers, and scattered ledgers. "You remained here until what hour yesterday?" "Nearly 8. And during that time no visitors called?" Marsh hesitated visibly. "One visitor." Holmes glanced sharply toward him. "A man or woman?" "A woman, sir." Lestrade leaned forward instantly. "Describe her." "She wore a dark veil and spoke softly, well-dressed, not from the docks." "Did you hear her name?" "No." Holmes stopped beside the fireplace. "But you heard the conversation." Marsh swallowed uneasily. "Only part of it." "What part?" The clerk lowered his voice. "She said, 'One innocent death is enough.'" A silence followed those words. I confess, the significance escaped me entirely. Holmes, however, grew suddenly intent. "How long did she remain?" 10 minutes, perhaps. Mr. Drew seemed frightened after she left." Holmes bent over the desk blotter and examined it closely through his lens. "Interesting." Holmes pointed toward several faint indentations pressed into the paper. A name written repeatedly. "What name?" "Clara." Lestrade frowned. "A sweetheart?" "Possibly," said Holmes softly. "Or a threat." From Wapping we journeyed deeper into the river districts, where Holmes insisted upon questioning various dockworkers connected to Drew's dealings. The eastern waterfront presented one of the strangest spectacles in all London. Great cranes towered above the quays while steamers crowded the filthy water beside endless warehouses of brick and iron. The smells proved overwhelming. Salt water, tar, coal smoke, wet rope, fish, machine grease, and horse dung mingled heavily in the damp air. Sailors shouted in half a dozen languages, while gulls wheeled overhead screaming above the river traffic. At length, Holmes led us into a riverside tavern known as the Mariner's Rest. The interior glowed dimly beneath gaslight and thick tobacco smoke. Rough dockworkers crowded the tables drinking gin and bitter ale, while somewhere near the rear, a cracked piano clattered noisily above bursts of drunken laughter. Its proprietress, Mrs. Keating, proved a broad-shouldered woman with sharp eyes and powerful red hands, roughened by years of labor. "You're asking about Drew," said she grimly. "Then you're asking for trouble." Holmes smiled faintly. "I have seldom feared trouble." Mrs. Keating snorted. Germans. Fancy gentlemen pretending to be merchants. "Did you know him? A decent man." She wiped a mug slowly with a cloth. "Too decent for the docks. He found something he should not have found." "What sort of thing?" She hesitated. "Documents." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "Naval documents?" Mrs. Keating crossed herself quickly. "I know nothing about that." As we rose to leave, Holmes paused beside the narrow staircase leading toward the upper rooms. He ran his fingers lightly along the wooden banister. "Fresh varnish," he murmured. I looked blankly at the polished rail. "And that interests you?" "It interests me greatly. I confess I saw nothing remarkable whatsoever." Holmes, however, appeared deeply satisfied. Outside once more. Rain drifted steadily across the docks, while the cold wind carried a bitter metallic taste from the river. "You suspect espionage now?" I asked as we walked. "I no longer suspect it." Holmes drew his coat tighter about him. "I know it. But what connection has it to Bellamy?" "That," said Holmes quietly, "is the central question." Toward afternoon, we visited Chatham Shipping Company near Blackwall. The building itself stood imposing and respectable beside the river warehouses, its brass fittings gleaming warmly against the grey weather outside. Percival Hodge received us in a richly furnished office, smelling of leather bindings, cigar smoke, and lamp oil. He was a stout, carefully dressed gentleman whose silver spectacles could not entirely conceal his nervousness. And his character? Hodge shifted uneasily. At one time I considered him trustworthy. At one time, circumstances altered my opinion. Holmes studied him silently for several moments. "You altered your opinion after pressure was applied." Hodge stiffened visibly. "That is absurd." "Indeed." Holmes's voice remained perfectly calm. "Then why avoid my eyes whenever Bellamy's name is mentioned?" The man flushed angrily. "You have no right." "Oh, but I have every right," said Holmes softly. "Because an innocent man may have been hanged yesterday." For one brief instant, genuine terror flashed across Percival Hodge's face. Looking back, the clue was plain as day. Did you see what I missed? Chapter 3. Deeper Waters. Holmes insisted upon returning once more to Warehouse 12, where Frederick Hale had met his death. The weather had grown colder still. A bitter wind swept inland from the Thames, carrying with it the smell of salt water, coal smoke, wet timber, and engine grease. Fog drifted low between the warehouses, while the river beyond appeared dark as molten lead beneath the grey afternoon sky. Holmes walked in silence beside me, hands thrust deep into the pockets of his long coat. I had learned by then that such silence indicated intense concentration. Though I could see the inspector's confidence in the original conviction beginning slowly to crumble. "You have inspected this place twice already," said Lestrade as we approached the warehouse entrance. "Not properly," Holmes replied quietly. The great iron doors groaned heavily upon their hinges as the constable unlocked them. Inside, the air smelled strongly of damp rope, machine oil, mildew, and old cargo crates. Weak daylight filtered through the dirty skylights overhead, casting long pale beams across the shadowy floor. Holmes moved immediately toward the loading platform near the river entrance. "Observe this crane mechanism, Watson." I bent beside him near a rusted pulley wheel fixed against the wall. "The grease appears fresh," said I. "Precisely." Holmes touched the metal lightly with one finger. This machinery had not been used for nearly a week before Hale's death. Lestrade frowned. "What does that prove?" "That someone lied." Holmes directed our attention upward, toward the heavy beams crossing beneath the ceiling. "A skilled operator could move crates silently from river barges into this warehouse after midnight. Smuggling," I suggested. "Not ordinary smuggling," Holmes straightened slowly. Something more delicate. He crossed the warehouse floor toward the desk, where Frederick Hale had supposedly discovered Bellamy standing over the body. Dust coated most of the surface heavily, save for one clear rectangular space near the corner. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "What now?" asked Lestrade impatiently. "Silver nitrate residue." Holmes pointed toward the faint discoloration upon the wood. "Photographic chemicals." I stared blankly at the mark. "You believe photography equipment was kept here?" "I know it was." Lestrade folded his arms skeptically. "And what possible connection has photography to murder?" Holmes smiled faintly. "In the matter of the Norwood builder, Watson," said he conversationally, "I once uncovered forgery through printer's ink trapped beneath a man's fingernails. Physical traces are often more honest than witnesses. Here we have photographic chemicals inside a dock warehouse, connected to stolen naval manifests. Someone was copying documents before sending them abroad. The implication chilled me immediately. "Foreign agents," I whispered. "Most likely. I confess, I had not anticipated the scale of the affair until that moment. The reader, perhaps, was more perceptive." Holmes continued his examination carefully around the warehouse floor. At length, he paused beside a narrow iron staircase, leading upward toward the storage gallery. "Blood," said he softly. Holmes examined it through his lens. Too high. A wounded hand, perhaps. Lestrade shook his head. Holmes replied, "It proves there was a struggle above the gallery before Hale died below." We climbed the staircase cautiously. The upper gallery overlooked the entire warehouse and smelled strongly of dust, rope fiber, and damp wood. Cargo crates stood stacked in shadowy rows beside the walls. Holmes suddenly knelt near one crate and picked up a small metallic object. "A cufflink," said I. "Yes." He handed it toward Lestrade. Lestrade stared. "You believe Hodge was here that night?" "I believe," said Holmes carefully, "that he wishes very badly for us not to know he was here." The discovery altered the entire complexion of the case. By evening, Holmes insisted upon pursuing another lead entirely. We traveled westward through rain-swept streets toward Bloomsbury, where Elias Merton maintained his fashionable photographic studio. The establishment occupied the upper floor of a handsome brick building overlooking Russell Square. Warm gaslight glowed behind velvet curtains, while the polished brass doorplate reflected the wet street outside. Merton himself received us with visible unease. "You again, Mr. Holmes. Your profession interests me increasingly," Holmes replied pleasantly. The studio smelled sharply of photographic chemicals, heated metal, and expensive cologne. Framed portraits lined the walls while glass plates rested carefully upon shelves near the darkroom entrance. Holmes wandered slowly among them. "You photographed Frederick Hale?" he asked casually. "Yes." "And Arthur Bellamy?" Merton hesitated. "Once." Holmes stopped before a cabinet containing several unfinished plates. "You also photographed naval warehouses?" The photographer stiffened visibly. "I photograph many locations." "Indeed." Holmes lifted one plate toward the lamplight. "Yet most photographers do not develop harbor defenses and customs records." Merton's composure began to crack. "You have no authority to question me." "No." said Holmes quietly. "But Scotland Yard does." "Perhaps not," Holmes replied, "but you know something of espionage." For several seconds Merton remained silent. Then at last he spoke in a strained whisper. "I only copied documents. Drew arranged everything." "For whom?" Holmes asked sharply. "I never learned." Holmes studied him carefully. "You are lying." Merton turned away toward the rain-streaked window. "I was paid well not to ask questions. I confess I remained uncertain whether the man feared arrest or something worse entirely." Holmes, however, seemed convinced of deeper danger. As we departed the studio, Holmes paused suddenly upon the staircase below. "Did you notice the scratches upon Merton's wrist?" he asked. "No. Rope burns," said Holmes softly. "Recent ones. And that signifies?" Holmes drew his coat tighter against the cold evening air. "That our photographer has spent time aboard ships recently." The answer lay before us, hidden in plain sight. Yet I failed to connect the details until much later. Rain poured steadily across Russell Square, while distant carriage wheels splashed through the flooded streets. He stared back toward the studio windows above. "Merton is frightened," said he quietly. "Of arrest?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, Watson. Of survival. Had I known what awaited us before dawn, I might have shared that fear myself." Chapter 4. Shadows and Suspicions. Holmes had scarcely settled into his chair at Baker Street that evening before a telegram arrived from Whitechapel. The message, hastily scrawled and badly smudged by rainwater, informed us that a body had been discovered near the river stairs below Limehouse Reach. "Merton," said Holmes instantly. Within 20 minutes we were again rattling eastward through the fog. The city seemed darker than ever that night. Rain drifted in thin, icy sheets across the streets, while the lamps glowed dimly through the yellow mist. I remember vividly the sounds of the wheels splashing through muddy gutters, the distant whistles from the river steamers, and the heavy tolling of church bells somewhere beyond the rooftops. The body proved not to be Merton's. Instead, we found one of Captain Vane's sailors lying dead beside the river steps, his skull fractured against the stones below. The smell of wet rope, mud, stale fish, and river water hung heavily in the air, while policemen moved silently through the fog carrying lanterns. Lestrade crouched beside the corpse grimly. "Another accident, perhaps," said he. "Hardly." Holmes pointed toward the dead sailor's knuckles. "Observe the skin. The man's right hand was bruised and torn." "He fought someone," said I. "Yes." Holmes touched the damp stones carefully. "And recently?" He rose and glanced toward the river, where dark barges drifted silently through the mist. "Captain Vane grows desperate." Lestrade frowned. "You still suspect the captain?" "I suspect everyone," Holmes replied quietly. "I confess I was entirely lost among the growing list of suspects. The reader perhaps followed the matter with greater clarity. The following morning, Holmes dispatched me alone to Camden Town, where Arthur Bellamy's widow occupied modest lodgings above a tobacconist's shop. The neighborhood smelled strongly of rain-soaked brick, horse manure, cheap tobacco, and frying bacon from the nearby market stalls. Mrs. Bellamy received me quietly within a small parlor warmed by a weak coal fire. She was a pale, dignified woman, dressed entirely in black mourning clothes. "My husband was innocent," said she, before I had spoken 3 sentences. "I believe that may indeed be true," I replied gently. Tears filled her eyes, though her voice remained remarkably steady. "Arthur feared something dreadful was happening at the docks. He told me Mr. Hale trusted him." "In what way?" "He helped him investigate missing cargo records." This revelation startled me profoundly. "Then Bellamy worked against Drew and the others?" She nodded slowly. "Arthur discovered someone was selling naval schedules to foreigners." I leaned forward immediately. "Did he name anyone involved?" Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. "Only one name, Hodge." That afternoon, I returned to Baker Street, where Holmes sat amid a clutter of shipping manifests, dock records, and newspaper clippings spread across the table. Thick blue pipe smoke curled lazily through the room, while rain tapped steadily against the windows. "You learned something useful," said Holmes without looking up. I repeated Mrs. Bellamy's statement carefully. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "As expected." "You already suspected Hodge?" "Strongly." "Then why not arrest him?" Holmes leaned back slowly in his chair. "Because suspicion is not proof, Watson." He handed me a shipping ledger. "Observe these entries." I studied the pages carefully. "Baltic cargo shipments." "Yes. Now note the dates." "I confess I noticed nothing unusual whatsoever." Holmes smiled faintly. "The shipments correspond exactly with Naval Fleet inspections." Understanding dawned upon me suddenly. The schedules were being sold abroad. "Precisely." Holmes rose and crossed toward the fireplace. "In hindsight, we should have known. The signs were there from the beginning." Late that evening, another suspect emerged unexpectedly. Inspector Lestrade arrived carrying a leather document case soaked with rainwater. "We searched Drew's private accounts," said he breathlessly. "Look at this." Inside the case lay several receipts connected to a gambling club in Soho. "Drew owed enormous sums," Lestrade continued, "nearly bankrupt." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Debt changes men, and desperate men kill," said Lestrade grimly. Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, desperate men make mistakes." Pike. The district appeared miserable beneath the grey afternoon sky. Doorways against the freezing wind. Everywhere came the sounds of shouting vendors, factory machinery, barking dogs, and drunken quarrels from nearby gin houses. Pike occupied rooms above an illegal gambling den, thick with cigar smoke and stale gin fumes. He was a narrow-faced creature with nervous eyes and nicotine-stained fingers. "You're asking dangerous questions, Mr. Holmes," said he uneasily. "I am accustomed to danger." Pike glanced repeatedly toward the door. Drew worked for bigger men. "Who?" Holmes asked sharply. "I never learned names." "But you learned enough to fear them." The criminal swallowed visibly. "There was a woman involved." "Clara?" Holmes asked immediately. Pike looked startled. "You know her?" "Describe her." "She came asking questions after Hale died. Drew hated her." "Why?" Pike lowered his voice. "Because she knew Bellamy was innocent." For several moments Holmes remained perfectly still. Then he asked softly, "Did Drew fear her?" "Yes." "More than the police?" Pike nodded without hesitation. As we departed into the cold evening air, I turned eagerly toward Holmes. "Clara knew the truth all along." "Yes." "Then why conceal herself?" Holmes's expression grew very grave indeed. because revealing the truth might kill her. Nothing in my experience prepared me for the dreadful certainty in Holmes's voice. That night, shortly before midnight, a second telegram arrived. Elias Merton had vanished from his Bloomsbury studio, and this time Holmes looked genuinely alarmed. Chapter 5. The Pursuit. Holmes wasted no time following news of Merton's disappearance. Before dawn had fully broken above London, we were already bound eastward in a police launch cutting through the dark waters of the Thames. A freezing wind swept across the river, while thick grey fog drifted low over the surface, like smoke from some monstrous engine. The steady throb of the launch motors vibrated beneath our feet. Coal smoke rolled heavily from nearby tugboats, while gulls screamed overhead through the mist. I remember distinctly the bitter taste of river fog upon my lips and the smell of wet rope, engine grease, and salt water clinging to our coats. Merton's landlord reported him missing shortly after midnight, said he. His rooms were abandoned in haste. And Captain Vane? Holmes asked. Still vanished. Holmes remained silent for several moments, eyes fixed upon the river ahead. Said he quietly. The police launch slowed beside a cargo steamer moored near Limehouse Reach. A nervous dock foreman waved frantically from the pier. "We found blood aboard!" he shouted as we approached. The vessel smelled strongly of diesel fuel, damp timber, spoiled fish, and stale tobacco smoke. Sailors moved anxiously about the deck, whispering among themselves, while Holmes examined the bloodstains near the cargo hatch. Said he softly. Lestrade pointed toward the lower deck. There's more below. We descended into a cramped storage compartment, lit only by a swinging lantern overhead. The air was close and suffocating with odors of machine oil, mildew, and wet canvas. Crates stamped with Baltic shipping marks stood stacked against the walls. Holmes suddenly knelt beside one of them. Interesting. I bent beside him. What is it? A camera plate. He lifted a broken fragment of photographic glass carefully into the lantern light. Merton, I whispered. Yes. Holmes examined the floor closely, and not willingly. Lestrade frowned. You believe he was brought here by force? Holmes pointed toward several marks in the damp dust. Observe the heel impressions. One man dragged another toward the rear hatch. I confess I noticed nothing remarkable until Holmes traced the pattern clearly with his cane. Looking back, the evidence was plain enough. Did you see what I missed? Said he. Holmes straightened slowly. Merton. At that instant, one of the sailors cried out from the dockside below. There! He shouted. A figure was running through the fog beyond the warehouses. Holmes moved instantly. After him. We raced ashore at once. The chase carried us through a maze of narrow alleys, crowded with cargo carts and dripping warehouse walls. Rain lashed across the cobblestones, while dock workers shouted angrily as we pushed past them. Somewhere nearby, a steam crane clattered noisily above the constant roar of the river. The fleeing man darted suddenly through an open warehouse door. "Warehouse 9!" cried Lestrade. Inside, darkness swallowed us almost entirely, save for weak shafts of grey daylight filtering through the roof. Overhead, the building smelled strongly of tar, wet rope, old timber, and machine grease. Footsteps thundered above us. "This way!" Holmes shouted. We pursued the figure up a steep iron staircase slick with moisture. My lungs burned painfully from the effort, while echoes rang wildly through the cavernous structure around us. At the upper gallery, the fugitive burst onto the loading cranes overlooking the river. Holmes followed without hesitation. Had I known what awaited us above those cranes, I might have hesitated myself. Rain drove fiercely across the exposed iron beams, while far below the Thames churned black beneath the fog. The fleeing man scrambled desperately along the narrow framework toward the outer platform. "Stop!" Lestrade roared. The figure turned suddenly and fired a revolver. The shot rang deafeningly across the river. I saw Holmes stagger slightly as the bullet tore through his coat sleeve. "Holmes!" I cried. "It is nothing," he snapped. The fugitive fired again wildly, before losing his footing upon the rain-slick iron. For one terrible instant he clung desperately to the crane arm high above the water. Then he slipped. The scream ended abruptly, with a distant splash far below. We stared downward into the swirling fog, where dark river currents rolled beneath the cranes. "No sign of him," muttered Lestrade grimly. Holmes pressed a handkerchief against his bleeding arm calmly. "Search boats immediately," said he. "Though I doubt you shall find the body." Back at Baker Street later that evening, Holmes finally allowed me to examine the wound. Fortunately, the bullet had merely grazed the flesh beneath his upper arm. "You were fortunate," said I while bandaging it. Holmes smiled faintly. "Fortune favors observation." He lit his pipe carefully once I had finished. "I confess I saw little beyond the revolver. Naval issue," Holmes replied. "Identical to impressions aboard Vane's freighter." Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. "In the affair of the Gloria Scott, Watson, I once observed how criminal conspiracies collapse under pressure. Fear destroys loyalty more effectively than police investigation ever could. Here we witness the same principle." "And Merton?" I asked quietly. Holmes's expression darkened. "Merton knew too much." Rain whispered softly against the windows, while somewhere beyond Baker Street, a cab rattled faintly through the wet night. Then Holmes stopped pacing abruptly. The Merivale Hotel. Holmes withdrew the torn paper fragment recovered aboard the freighter. Merton attempted to reach someone there before he disappeared. "And who might that be?" I asked. Holmes stared thoughtfully into the fire. "The one person capable of proving Arthur Bellamy innocent." Resolution was approaching swiftly now, though none of us yet understood how terrible the truth would prove to be. Chapter 6. The Past Speaks. Far removed from the misery and noise of the eastern docks, its polished brass lamps glowed warmly through the grey afternoon fog, while liveried servants moved silently across thick carpets within the entrance hall. The contrast to Limehouse could scarcely have been greater. The lobby smelled pleasantly of beeswax, expensive cigars, fresh coffee, and ladies' perfume. A fire crackled softly beneath a marble mantel, while rain tapped steadily against the tall windows overlooking the street outside. Holmes removed his gloves slowly as we approached the reception desk. "You have stayed here before," said I quietly. "Twice," Holmes replied. "Diplomats favor the establishment. That fact alone interests me." The manager proved a nervous, silver-haired gentleman named Wilcox, who became visibly uneasy the moment Holmes mentioned Elias Merton. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. "Mr. Merton visited several times during recent months." "Alone?" Holmes asked. The man swallowed. "He occasionally met a lady here." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Her name?" "Mrs. Clara Hale." The revelation startled me profoundly. "Hale?" I exclaimed. "Frederick Hale's widow?" Holmes nodded slowly, though I could see from his expression that he had anticipated the answer already. I confess, the significance escaped me entirely at that moment. The reader perhaps connected the matter sooner than I. Wilcox led us into a private sitting room overlooking the rain-soaked street. The furniture smelled faintly of polished oak and cigar smoke, while the heavy velvet curtains muffled the sounds of passing traffic beyond. "Mrs. Hale arrived yesterday evening," said the manager quietly. "But she departed before dawn." "Did she leave an address?" Holmes asked. "No, sir." Holmes considered silently for several moments. "Describe her condition." Wilcox frowned slightly. She appeared frightened. Exhausted, too. "And Merton?" "He never arrived." Holmes's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Outside, carriage wheels splashed through the wet streets, while somewhere nearby, a station whistle shrieked faintly through the fog. "She knows," Holmes murmured. "Knows what?" asked Lestrade impatiently. "Everything." Within the hour, Holmes located Clara Hale through inquiries among hotel servants and railway porters. We found her eventually in a modest boarding house near Kensington Gardens, where she occupied rooms under the false name of Mrs. Montrose. The landlady admitted us reluctantly after Holmes produced his card. Clara Hale received us inside a small parlour warmed by a coal fire burning low in the grate. She wore deep mourning black, and though fatigue marked her face heavily, she carried herself with remarkable composure. For several moments no one spoke. Then Holmes removed his hat quietly. At those words her expression broke entirely. "Yes," she whispered. The room smelled faintly of lavender water, damp wool, and cooling tea. Rain drifted softly against the windows, while the fire crackled weakly between us. I was too late. Holmes remained standing beside the mantel. "Tell us everything." For several seconds, Clara Hale stared silently into the flames before beginning her account. "My husband discovered irregularities among naval cargo schedules nearly a year ago," said she quietly. Ships carrying defense materials were being monitored with impossible accuracy. Foreign governments, Holmes said softly. She nodded. Frederick believed someone inside the docks was selling information abroad. And Bellamy? I asked. He helped my husband secretly. A faint sadness crossed her face. Bellamy copied suspicious manifests, while Hale traced payments passing through dock brokers and shipping agents. Their investigation eventually led toward Silas Drew. Drew handled the exchanges, Clara continued bitterly. But he was never the mastermind. Hodge, said Holmes. Again she nodded. I confess the full horror of the affair only became clear to me then. An innocent man had marched calmly to the gallows, while the true architect of the conspiracy remained respected and wealthy. The signs were there from the beginning, I later reflected, yet I failed entirely to perceive them. Holmes paced slowly toward the window. Tell me about the night Hale died. Frederick arranged to meet Bellamy inside Warehouse 12 after receiving proof against Hodge. I followed secretly because he feared danger. Her voice faltered briefly. Hodge arrived first. The fire cracked sharply in the silence which followed. They argued beside the loading platform. Frederick threatened exposure. Holmes said quietly. Yes. Clara closed her eyes. Instead of helping, he assisted the cover-up. Bellamy entered afterward. He found Frederick dying beside the crates. And Drew altered the timeline, said Holmes. So Bellamy appeared guilty. They promised Arthur would receive mercy if he remained silent about the espionage. But he was hanged instead, I said bitterly. Holmes's expression hardened visibly. One innocent death was apparently insufficient. For several moments only the rain disturbed the silence of the room. Then Holmes spoke again. You confronted Drew recently. Yes. At the auction office? Clara looked startled. How did you know? The burned letters. Holmes withdrew one charred fragment carefully from his pocket. You begged him to confess. Tears filled her eyes. He laughed at me. And afterward? He threatened to expose Frederick publicly as a traitor unless I disappeared. Holmes's face darkened. Then someone silenced Drew first. The implication hung heavily between us all. Who murdered him? Asked Lestrade sharply. Clara shook her head slowly. I do not know. Had I known how near we stood to the final revelation, I might have understood the strange intensity already burning in Holmes's eyes. Chapter 7. The Truth Emerges. The arrest of Percival Hodge took place on a damp afternoon beneath a lowering sky. Rain fell steadily upon the streets outside Chatham Shipping Company, while within its polished offices, the atmosphere had grown thick with tension. Holmes, Lestrade, and I stood together in the main counting room as clerks whispered nervously behind glass partitions. Hodge attempted composure when first confronted. "This is absurd," he said sharply. "I am a respected businessman." Holmes did not raise his voice. He seldom needed to. Cigar ash, lamp oil, and damp wool coats. Outside, carriage wheels splashed through puddles, while distant dock whistles echoed faintly through the fog. Holmes stepped forward and turned the object slowly beneath the light. "Initials PH," he said softly. "A curious coincidence, would you not agree?" For an instant, something flickered across Hodge's face, something like fear, quickly suppressed. Holmes continued without pause. "You were present at Warehouse 12 on the night Frederick Hale died. That is a lie, is it?" Holmes moved toward him with measured calm. "Then perhaps you can explain the silver nitrate residue on your gloves." Hodge stiffened. "I know nothing of your accusations." Holmes turned slightly toward Lestrade. "You searched the freighter's cargo hold?" "We did, and found photographic equipment traces." Lestrade nodded. Holmes faced Hodge again. Someone was copying naval manifests. Someone with access to shipping ledgers and diplomatic schedules. Hodge's voice rose. "You have no proof." Holmes's reply was quiet, almost conversational. "On the contrary, we have too much. I confess, I observed Hodge carefully at that moment. Though I did not yet understand how completely the truth had already closed around him. Holmes began pacing slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "Frederick Hale uncovered your operation," he said. "He intended to expose it through Bellamy's testimony." "An honest man," Holmes corrected. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a brass clock upon the mantel. Holmes continued. "You met Hale at Warehouse 12. There was an argument. He threatened immediate disclosure." Hodge's jaw tightened. "He struck me first." "So you claim," Holmes replied evenly. "Yet the wound upon Hale's skull indicates a downward strike from a heavy implement." Lestrade leaned forward. "A cargo hook," he muttered. Holmes nodded. "You killed him." Hodge's face reddened. "It was an accident." "An accident, followed by deliberate deception," Holmes said quietly. "Drew witnessed the act." At the mention of Drew, Hodge froze momentarily. Holmes watched him carefully. "And Drew cooperated with your cover-up, but only temporarily." Silence settled heavily upon the room. Then Holmes spoke again. "Until he demanded more money." Hodge's composure finally broke. "He was extorting me." Lestrade stepped forward immediately. "And so you killed him?" "No!" Hodge shouted. Holmes's voice sharpened slightly. "You arranged for him to fall from his balcony. Machine oil on the railing confirms crane access. Dockworker boots confirm your route of escape." Holmes produced a final document from his coat. "This ledger shows payments routed through your accounts to foreign shipping agents." Hodge stared at it in disbelief. You cannot. I can, Holmes interrupted calmly. And I have. A long silence followed. Outside, rain struck the windows in steady, rhythmic patterns, while somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled across the river. Then Hodge spoke again, his voice lower now. You will never prove Bellamy innocent. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. On the contrary, he said, that is precisely what we have already done. Lestrade looked startled. Holmes turned toward us both. Clara Hale's testimony confirms Bellamy's role as investigator, not murderer. Drew's photographic plates confirm Hale's timeline, and Merton's records confirm the espionage network. I confess I stared at Holmes in growing admiration. Once chaotic and confused, now stood revealed in chilling clarity. Yet one question remained. Captain Vane? I asked quietly. Holmes's expression darkened slightly. Dead. Lestrade frowned. How? Holmes hesitated for the first time. Murdered before he could speak further. A heavy silence followed that statement. Then Holmes added softly, the conspirators began eliminating each other the moment pressure increased. Hodge sank slowly into a chair. You have destroyed everything, he muttered. No, Holmes replied. You did that yourself. At that moment, the door opened abruptly, and a clerk entered, carrying a telegram. Captain Vane's body has been recovered near Greenwich. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. So the river keeps its secrets no longer. I confess a chill passed through me then, which had nothing to do with the weather outside. Holmes laid the final sequence of events before us at Baker Street. The room smelled of burning coal, strong pipe tobacco, and damp overcoats drying near the fire. Rain continued to whisper against the windows while gaslight flickered softly across the walls. You know my methods, Holmes began quietly. Let us proceed logically. He placed photographs, ledgers, and burned letters across the table. Drew handled transactions. Merton copied documents. Hodge financed the operation. Vane transported materials. And Bellamy? Lestrade asked. Holmes's voice softened slightly. An innocent man caught between truth and corruption. Silence filled the room. Then Holmes added more quietly, and Frederick Hale died because he refused to compromise. For a long time no one spoke. I remember watching Holmes then, standing motionless beside the fire. The light caught his sharp profile, while smoke curled upward from his pipe like drifting shadows. Did Bellamy ever stand a chance? I asked at last. Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly, no. The word fell heavily into the room. Outside, London continued as always, unaware, indifferent, relentless. And somewhere in its fog-shrouded streets, the consequences of that single mistake still echoed like footsteps that would never fade. Chapter 8. Justice. London had taken to the affair with a kind of grim fascination, as it so often does when respectable names fall into disgrace. The East End spoke of nothing else. The West End pretended it had never occurred. From our rooms at Baker Street, I watched Holmes move through it all with his usual outward calm, though I knew him well enough to see the strain beneath the surface. He played his violin more often, sometimes late into the night, and more than once I found him standing motionless at the window, pipe unlit, gaze fixed upon the drifting fog beyond the glass. The air in 221B carried the familiar mixture of coal smoke, strong tobacco, paper, and polished wood. Mrs. Hudson complained daily about the damp creeping through the walls, while outside, the rattle of hansom cabs, distant shouts of vendors, and the tolling of Big Ben reminded us that the city never slept. Lestrade visited frequently during this period. He appeared less certain each time. "We have Hodge," he said one evening, standing near the fireplace. "But the newspapers are tearing us apart. They say we executed the wrong man." Holmes did not look up from his notes. "They are correct," he said simply. Lestrade bristled. "That is not helpful." "It is accurate," Holmes replied. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the crackle of burning coal and the faint whistle of wind through the chimney. The trial of Percival Hodge began in late November at the Old Bailey. The courtroom smelled of damp wool coats, polished wood, ink, and candle smoke. Outside, rain fell in steady sheets against the stone steps, where crowds gathered shouting for justice, reform, and in some cases, simply spectacle. Inside, Clara Hale testified first. She wore black mourning dress and spoke with a calm that surprised even the judge. Her voice trembled only once, when she spoke of Frederick Hale's final hours. "He tried to stop them," she said softly. "He believed truth mattered more than safety." I noticed several jurors shifting uneasily in their seats. Holmes observed everything in silence from the gallery. When Elias Merton was called, he appeared pale and shaken. He described the photographic work done for Silas Drew and the documents he had unknowingly copied. "I thought it was business," he said. "Nothing more." "And the naval records?" asked the prosecutor. His voice broke slightly. "I only took the photographs." Lestrade leaned toward me. "He is telling the truth," he murmured. Holmes nodded faintly. "Yes," he said quietly. "For once he is." When my own testimony came, I spoke only to Bellamy's character and Hale's investigation. I remember the smell of ink and wax candles, the heavy silence of the courtroom, and the distant sound of rain against stained glass windows above. Holmes was called last. He stood calmly in the witness box, tall and composed, his fingers lightly touching the rail before him. The courtroom quieted immediately. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the judge asked. "I am. And you have investigated this matter independently." "I have." The prosecutor attempted to challenge him several times, but Holmes answered each question with measured precision. At one point, he placed a set of photographs upon the table. "These were taken by Elias Merton," he said. "They show the naval schedule crates before shipment. They also show Mr. Hodge present at the dock warehouse on the night of the murder." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor frowned. "And what does that prove?" Holmes looked at him steadily. That truth often survives where people do not expect it. There was a brief pause. Then Holmes added quietly, "When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." I saw several jurors exchange glances at that. The trial lasted 3 days. Hodge maintained innocence throughout, but inconsistencies in his statements gradually collapsed under scrutiny. Dock records, photographic plates, and Clara Hale's testimony formed a chain of evidence too strong to ignore. Yet even as conviction became inevitable, there remained an uncomfortable silence surrounding one matter: Arthur Bellamy. After sentencing, Holmes requested a private meeting with the Home Office representative. I accompanied him through corridors smelling of paper, ink, coal dust, and damp stone. I require formal exoneration of Arthur Bellamy, Holmes said without preamble. That man has already been executed. Yes, Holmes replied. Wrongfully. The room fell silent. The official hesitated. You are asking for the impossible. Holmes's eyes hardened slightly. I am asking for justice. Weeks later, a formal review concluded Bellamy had been wrongly convicted. His name was cleared posthumously. The announcement appeared quietly in the newspapers, buried beneath shipping reports and parliamentary debates. There was no celebration, only silence. I remember Clara Hale receiving the letter at her lodging in Kensington. She read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it upon the mantel. He will not hear it, she said simply. No, I replied. She nodded. But it matters that it was said. Holmes said nothing. Back at Baker Street, he stood by the window for a long time. Justice, he said at last, is a curious thing, Watson. It arrives late more often than not. The room smelled of burning coal, old leather, and pipe smoke. Outside, London continued as always. Fog rolling in from the river, gas lamps flickering, carriages clattering through wet streets. Lestrade visited one final time. He will hang, he said quietly of Hodge. Yes, Holmes replied. And Bellamy? Exonerated, I said. Lestrade nodded slowly. It does not feel like victory. Holmes turned slightly from the window. Silence settled over Baker Street. I watched Holmes sit by the fire, his violin resting untouched beside him. Do you regret it? I asked at last. He did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly, I regret arriving one day too late. As I write these lines, I still remember the look in his eyes. Calm, analytical, and yet touched by something deeper than logic alone. Justice had been served, but not in time to save the innocent. Chapter 9. Restoration. The legal machinery completed its final motions in the Bellamy affair. The streets outside Baker Street were often glazed with ice in the early mornings, and the fog lay so thick at times that even the nearest gas lamps appeared as pale halos suspended in a milky void. Inside 221B, however, there was a fragile sense of calm returning. The coal fire burned steadily, filling the room with warmth and the familiar sense of tobacco, polished wood, ink, and old leather. Mrs. Hudson, relieved to see us less frequently visited by police inspectors and telegram boys, spoke of the house returning to proper normality, though I doubt Baker Street had ever known such a thing. Holmes, for his part, remained unchanged in appearance, though I noticed a subtle quietness in him. He spent long hours reviewing case notes, sometimes without reading them, simply turning pages, as though searching for something that lay beyond words. Lestrade arrived one morning with a final document. It is complete, he said, placing it on the table. Holmes glanced at it briefly. The official exoneration, Lestrade nodded. Bellamy's conviction has been formally annulled, posthumous pardon granted. Compensation arranged for the widow. A long silence followed. Outside, a carriage passed through the fog, with dull iron wheels, the sound fading quickly into the damp air. Clara Hale did not visit Baker Street again. Instead, she sent a brief letter of thanks. Holmes read it once and placed it carefully in a drawer without comment. I noticed that he did not smoke his pipe for the rest of that morning. Later that week, Holmes and I attended a quiet meeting at the Home Office. The building smelled of wax polish, coal smoke, damp stone corridors, and ink drying upon official papers. Clerks moved briskly through the halls, their footsteps echoing faintly like distant machinery. The undersecretary who received us was a thin, tired-looking man with ink-stained fingers. "You understand," he said carefully, "that this matter must remain discreet." Holmes smiled faintly. "Discretion is the currency of government." The man shifted uncomfortably. "Public admission of error in an execution would be inconvenient," Holmes finished for him. "Yes." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "Inconvenience is not a sufficient reason to withhold truth." The undersecretary did not respond immediately. At length he said, "The matter is closed." Snow had begun to fall lightly over Westminster, dusting the rooftops and carriage wheels in white. The river beyond moved sluggishly, a dark ribbon beneath the winter sky. "Justice achieved," I said as we walked. Holmes said nothing at first. Then, after several steps, he replied, "Partial justice." I glanced at him. "Because it came too late?" "Yes." We walked in silence for some time. The crunch of snow beneath our boots, the only sound between us. That afternoon, Holmes received an unexpected visitor. Captain Lestrade arrived alone, his coat dusted with frost, his face more lined than I remembered. "There is something else," he said without preamble. Holmes motioned him to sit. Lestrade did not. We traced one financial route to a consular address. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Which consulate?" Lestrade hesitated. "Russian." A quiet tension settled in the room. Holmes turned toward the fire. "So Hodge was not acting alone," he said softly. "Possibly not," Lestrade admitted. "And yet the network collapses with him." "Yes," Holmes exhaled slowly. "Convenient." I confess I noticed then a subtle change in Holmes's expression. Less satisfaction than concern, as though a pattern had resolved itself into something larger than the case we had solved. The music was slow, mournful, and filled the room with a strange sense of distance. Outside, snow continued to fall over Baker Street, softening the edges of the city until even the gas lamps seemed to float rather than stand. I sat reading beside the fire, though little of the text remained in my mind. At length I spoke. "You are still troubled." Holmes did not stop playing. "The case is closed, Watson," he said at last, "but not finished in your mind." The violin lowered slightly. "No case is ever truly finished," he replied. "Only abandoned." The fire crackled softly. After a time I asked, "Do you believe Bellamy would have forgiven us?" Holmes was silent for several moments. Then he said, "Bellamy was not concerned with forgiveness, only truth." A gust of wind pressed against the windows, carrying with it the distant sound of bells from Westminster. Holmes finally set the violin down. "The city will forget him," I said quietly. Yes, Holmes replied. Settling upon the silent streets of London. A lone cab moved slowly through the whitened road, its wheels cutting faint tracks that would soon be erased. Yet we will not forget, I said. Holmes looked toward me then, his expression unreadable. No, he agreed softly. We will not. Achieved, but in memory that refused to fade. Chapter 10. Baker Street Reflections. The winter fog had not lifted when I began writing these final pages of the Bellamy affair. The city reduced to shapes and shadows beyond the window panes of our rooms at Baker Street. Gas lamps burned weakly in the street below, their light swallowed almost as soon as it touched the drifting fog. The coal fire crackled steadily, casting orange light across the worn carpets, scattered papers, and familiar clutter of Holmes's domain. The air carried the usual mixture of tobacco smoke, polished wood, ink, and faint traces of chemical reagents from Holmes's experiments. Holmes sat in his armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in thought. His violin lay untouched upon the table beside him. For once, he seemed less occupied with deduction than reflection. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea earlier, its aroma still lingering, strong, slightly bitter, and comforting in its familiarity. I have been listening, he said. To what? To the absence of noise. A carriage rattled faintly outside, its wheels muffled by the fog, then faded into silence again. Somewhere in the distance, Big Ben struck the hour, each toll softened by the thick air. The case of Arthur Bellamy had concluded officially days earlier. The newspapers had already moved on to other scandals, dock strikes, political debates, a railway collapse in the north. The city's attention, as always, proved both intense and fleeting. Lestrade had visited briefly that morning. He looked older than I remembered. Hodge will not speak further, he said. He has withdrawn into silence. The Foreign Office has taken over what remains of the investigation. Holmes had nodded without comment. Now, in the quiet of the afternoon, I watched him more carefully than usual. There was something restrained in his stillness, as though the conclusion of the case had left behind not satisfaction, but a kind of hollow clarity. You never told me everything you suspected, I said finally. A faint smile touched his lips. No, he agreed. It never is. The fire snapped softly. I rose and moved toward the window. Outside, the street was almost entirely consumed by fog. Only the nearest gas lamp remained visible, its glow trembling like a fragile memory. You believe there is more behind this case, I said. Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he spoke quietly. There is always more behind a case. Watson, we simply choose where to stop looking. I turned back toward him. And where have we stopped? Holmes lifted his gaze slowly. At the point where truth becomes politically inconvenient. A silence followed that statement. The words carried no accusation, only observation. I returned to my chair, unsettled by the calm certainty in his tone. For a time, neither of us spoke. The fire continued its steady rhythm, and the room seemed suspended between past and future, as though unwilling to move on from what had occurred. At last, Holmes rose and walked to the mantelpiece. He picked up a small stack of papers, case notes, reports, fragments of correspondence, and arranged them neatly. You kept Bellamy's name in your records, I observed. Yes. Why? Holmes paused. Because he was the only truly innocent man in the entire affair. I studied him, and that troubles you. Holmes's expression softened slightly, though not into anything resembling comfort. It is not innocence that troubles me, he said. It is its vulnerability. The fog pressed closer against the windows, dimming even the glow of the gas lamps. Would you have changed anything, if you could? Holmes considered this for a long moment. Then he said, almost gently, I would have arrived 1 day earlier. No further explanation followed. Somewhere below, a cab driver shouted into the fog, his voice swallowed almost instantly by the city's damp silence. Later that evening, Holmes took up his violin again. This time the melody was lighter, though no less thoughtful. I remained by the fire, watching him as he played, the notes drifting through the room like fragments of something unspoken. When he finally set the instrument down, he spoke without turning. Watson. Yes? His eyes steady. Do not make it more comforting than it was. I have never known you to care about comfort in storytelling. A faint trace of amusement returned to his expression. I do not, he said. But others do. The firelight flickered across the room. Indifferent to the conclusions reached within these walls. At length, I closed my notebook. Holmes shook his head slightly. No, he replied. From somewhere beyond Baker Street came the distant sound of footsteps on wet stone, fading into the night. And in that quiet moment, I understood something I had not fully grasped during the investigation itself, that even when justice arrives too late, memory remains, precise, unyielding, and far more enduring than any verdict of the courts. Holmes rose and extinguished the lamp. Outside, London continued to breathe beneath its fog, and the case of Arthur Bellamy, though closed in law, would never be entirely closed in thought.